Imagine this. You wake up in the morning. You eat breakfast. You kiss your children goodbye. And then you go to work, knowing there is a very real chance you will not come home tonight. Not because of a war. Not because of a disaster. Simply because of your job. Today we are going to talk about professions that existed for centuries and took people's lives quietly, without obituaries, without compensation, without anyone asking questions. These people built our world, literally with their bodies. Some of the facts you're about to hear will shock you. Some will change the way you look at your own life forever. Stay until the end, because the last profession on this list is the most disturbing one. Not because of the danger, but because of who these people actually were. Before the Industrial Revolution, before trade unions, before workplace safety laws, there existed an entire world of professions that history almost never mentions. They are not romanticized in films. They are not taught in schools. And yet, the people who descended into mines without lights, who bathed the dead in strangers' homes, who chewed mercury and breathed lead, these are the people who kept civilization running. Today we walk through 8 of those professions. From the Middle Ages to the early 20th century. From Britain to continental Europe. Real people. Real deaths. Real history. London. The 1780s. You are 6 years old. Your master, a chimney sweep, grabs you by the ankles and pushes you headfirst into a flue 25 centimeters wide. Your job, climb upward, scraping soot with your elbows, your knees, your spine. No protection.
No mask.
No light. This was real, documented practice in Britain from the 17th century through the 19th. Children, mostly orphans or boys sold by desperate families, were trained not to fear heights or fire. Their skin was rubbed with salt water and brine to toughen it. This was called hardening. Most of them had chronic lung disease before the age of 10. They also suffered from what became known as chimney sweep's cancer, a scrotal tumor first described by Surgeon Percival Pott in 1775. It was the first documented occupational cancer in the history of medicine. Some boys got stuck inside chimneys. What came out was no longer a boy. A law banning this practice was finally passed in 1875, after a 12-year-old named George Medway suffocated inside a flue, and the case sparked national outrage. If you have ever seen the vivid red in Roman frescoes or Renaissance paintings, you were looking at cinnabar. Mercury sulfide. One of the most beautiful and most poisonous pigments in the history of art. It was mined, and that alone was a death sentence. But who turned the raw or into usable pigment? In certain craft workshops of medieval Spain and Italy, workers ground cinnabar by hand, sometimes using their mouths to achieve the finest possible texture. They literally chewed the mixture to the right consistency. Mercury poisoning develops slowly. First the hands begin to tremble. Then the teeth fall out. Then come the hallucinations. Then death. The average career of such a worker lasted 3 to 5 years. But even without direct contact, the cinnabar mines of Almaden in Spain were so lethal that convicted criminals were sent there instead of being executed. Working in those mines was considered worse than the gallows. Pliny the Elder wrote in the 1st century AD that workers wore masks made from animal bladders. The masks didn't save them. They just delayed the end. Now here is a profession that didn't kill through poison or fire. It killed through something far more invisible. The 19th century. The Industrial Revolution. Factories in Manchester, Birmingham, and across Europe started at 5 in the morning. Almost nobody owned an alarm clock. They were expensive. Being late to your shift meant a fine or immediate dismissal. And so a profession appeared, the knocker-up. This person, usually an elderly woman or man, walked the streets at 4 in the morning and tapped on workers' windows with a long pole, or blew dried peas through a tin tube, or simply shouted outside the door. They were paid a few pennies a week. They walked in rain, snow, and fog, every day, without weekends, for years. But why does this belong on a list of deadly professions? Because the knocker-up never slept properly. Chronic sleep deprivation, constant colds, arthritis from the cold and damp. Their average life expectancy was 12 to 15 years below the norm. The most famous knocker-up was a woman named Mary Smith, photographed on the streets of London still doing her rounds in the 1930s. Yes, this profession survived into the 20th century. It disappeared only when mass-produced alarm clocks finally became cheap enough for ordinary people to afford. The 17th and 18th centuries. Gunpowder was the foundation of armies, navies, and mining. And every single batch had to be tested for quality. How? Very simply. A worker took a handful of powder, ignited it, and observed the color and shape of the flame. An experienced tester could determine from the character of the burn whether the ratio of sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter was correct. This sounds almost elegant, until the first mistake. Gunpowder dust settled into clothing, hair, and lungs. A single stray spark and a man became a torch. At a powder works in Essex in 1916, one explosion killed 115 people in seconds. But even without explosions, chronic inhalation of powder destroyed the lungs. Most testers were coughing blood before the age of 40. And still they came back every morning, because there was no other way to earn a living. Victorian London, the 1840s. The sewers had not yet been built. Rats were everywhere, in homes, markets, warehouses. They carried plague, typhus, leptospirosis. And so there appeared a man named Jack Black, the official rat catcher of Queen Victoria. This is a real person with a real royal appointment. He caught rats with his bare hands, every day, by the thousands. Some he sold for rat baiting, a popular entertainment in Victorian Britain. Others he sent to laboratories. Most rat catchers died from bites. Leptospirosis, a bacterial infection carried in rodent urine, can kill within a week through kidney failure. Even more dangerous was working in the sewer tunnels beneath the city, where the concentration of pathogens was beyond measurement. Jack Black survived dozens of bites and countless infections. His stories were recorded by journalist Henry Mayhew in the book London Labour and the London Poor, one of the first works of social documentation in history. Jack once said, "I am used to bites. It is like a handshake from a rat, but some handshakes kill." You have heard the phrase mad as a hatter. You probably think it comes from Lewis Carroll's imagination. It does not. It comes from medical fact. In the 18th and 19th centuries, felt hats were treated with mercury nitrate in a process called carroting, named for the orange color the chemical gave to animal fur. Mercury made the fur soft and workable. Workers in felt factories inhaled mercury vapor every day for years. The symptoms of poisoning were uncontrollable trembling of the hands, known as the hatter's shakes, memory loss, paranoia, aggression, and hallucinations. They genuinely appeared to lose their minds. And they died young, most of them never understanding why. Lewis Carroll knew about this phenomenon. His Mad Hatter was not a fantasy. It was a portrait of real men. The use of mercury nitrate in hat production was not banned in the United States until 1941. Edinburgh, the 1820s. Medical universities were flourishing. Students were learning anatomy. But there was one critical problem. Teaching required cadavers. The law permitted dissection only of executed criminals, and there were never enough of them. And so the resurrection men appeared. These were people who dug up fresh graves at night and sold the bodies to medical schools. It was illegal but extraordinarily well paid. One body fetched £7 to £10 sterling. A regular laborer earned £1 per week. The risks were enormous. Arrest meant prison, and furious families could and did kill on sight. So resurrection men worked in teams, with lookouts posted at cemetery gates. The most infamous case was Burke and Hare, Edinburgh, 1828. They went further than grave robbery. They began murdering people and selling the bodies. 16 victims. They were caught. Burke was hanged. Hare testified against his partner and walked free. The scandal led directly to the Anatomy Act of 1832, which legalized the use of unclaimed bodies from workhouses for medical dissection. The resurrection men disappeared, but anatomy flourished. And now the last one, the least dramatic, the quietest, and perhaps the saddest of all, the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Postage stamps, envelopes, the glue on the back, a mixture of dextrin, chromate compounds, and various industrial chemicals. In postal sorting facilities, entire departments of women were employed to manually moisten and affix stamps to large batches of outgoing correspondence. Thousands of stamps a day, pressed to the tongue, hour after hour. The result was chemical damage to the mucous membranes of the mouth, tongue ulcers, and in many cases oral cancers. These women were slowly poisoning themselves every single day, and they had no idea. They were not heroes. They did not know they were doing anything dangerous. They simply worked, every day, and died quietly. That is why this profession is last on our list. Not because it is the most terrifying, but because it is the most invisible. Because most deaths in history were exactly like this, silent, unrecorded, without memorial plaques or monuments or anyone left to remember their names. We live in a world with workplace safety regulations, sick leave, pensions, and dust masks. A world where any job that damages your health demands compensation and protection. But this world was built on the bones of people who chewed mercury, climbed into chimneys as children, and dug up graves in the dark. People without surnames, without obituaries, without memory. They were not painted on coins or honored in cathedrals, but they made everything else possible. The architecture, the science, the trade, the art, the medicine. The next time you have a hard day at work, remember the 6-year-old boy in the London chimney. Remember the woman at the postal factory who didn't even know she was dying. If this video made you think, leave a like. Not for the algorithm, for them, so that at least someone else gets to know they existed. Subscribe to the channel, because next week we are going to talk about something that will make today's video look almost cheerful by comparison. But before you go, I want to leave you with one thought that I keep coming back to every single time I research topics like this one. We tend to think of the past as something distant, something that happened to other people, in other times, in a world so fundamentally different from ours that we can barely picture it. And in many ways, that is true. We have electricity. We have hospitals. We have laws that say your employer cannot send a 6-year-old into a burning chimney and call it a career. We have come an enormous distance from the world we just described. But here is the question that never quite leaves me after making a video like this. How much of what we just talked about was actually hidden at the time? Was it secret? Was it a scandal that people whispered about behind closed doors, hoping nobody would find out? No, it was not. It was completely visible. The chimney boys climbed in broad daylight on the streets of London. Everybody saw them. The hat factories operated in the center of cities. The smell of mercury and chemicals drifted through open windows. The rat catchers walked through markets with their cages. The knocker-up passed under your window every single morning at 4 o'clock, tapping her pole against the glass, and you pulled your blanket tighter and went back to sleep without once wondering what her life was like or how long she had been walking in the cold. It was not hidden. It was simply not seen. And that is a very different thing. There is a particular kind of blindness that comfortable societies develop over time. It is not the blindness of ignorance. It is the blindness of convenience. When a system works for the people who have the power to change it, the people who are being destroyed by that same system become very easy not to notice. They are there. They are visible. They are doing their jobs directly in front of you. But noticing them, truly noticing them, asking what their life costs them, asking whether it has to be this way, that requires something most people in every era find very difficult to do. It requires you to be uncomfortable on purpose. The physicians who finally described cinnabar poisoning had access to the minds. They could see the workers. They could see the trembling hands and the hollow eyes and the men who seemed decades older than their actual age. But the documentation, the formal acknowledgement, the moment when someone in a position of authority sat down and wrote the words, "This is killing them and we need to stop it," that took generations. Not because the evidence was unclear, because the evidence was inconvenient. Percival Pott described chimney sweeps cancer in 1775. The law protecting chimney boys was not passed until 1875. 100 years. 1 century passed between a doctor writing down what everyone already knew and a government deciding to do something about it. During those 100 years, tens of thousands of boys climbed into those flues. During those 100 years, every single person who hired a chimney sweep knew, on some level, what they were participating in. And they hired one anyway, because the chimney needed to be cleaned and the boy was cheap and someone else's problem. I am not telling you this to make you feel guilty about people who lived 2 centuries ago. I am telling you this because this is exactly how these things always work. It was not unique to Victorian England. It was not a product of a particularly cruel culture or a particularly callous generation. It was the default setting of human societies when the cost of a system is paid entirely by people who have no voice in how that system is run. And so we come back to the uncomfortable question. Not as a rhetorical device. Not as a way to end the video on a dramatic note. As a genuine and serious question that I think is worth sitting with. What is visible right now that we are choosing not to see? What industries exist today where the workers go home at the end of a shift carrying something invisible inside them? Something in their lungs, in their bloodstream, in their nervous system, that will not show up in a diagnosis for another 10 or 20 years? What jobs are being done right now by people who have no alternative? In conditions that future generations will look back on with the same disbelief we feel when we read about 6-year-olds in chimneys. We know, for example, that certain mining operations in parts of the world today operate under conditions that would have been familiar to the workers of Almaden. We know that agricultural laborists in multiple countries work for years in direct contact with pesticides that are banned in wealthier nations. We know that electronics manufacturing, the industry that produces the devices most of us are holding in our hands right now, involves materials and processes with serious long-term health consequences for the people doing the work. We know this. It is documented. It is not hidden. It is simply convenient not to think about too carefully. I am not saying this to paralyze you or to tell you that nothing has improved, because things absolutely have improved. The distance between the world of the chimney sweep boys and the world we live in today is real and it matters, and it was won through enormous effort by people who decided to be uncomfortable on purpose. Reformers, journalists, physicians, workers who organized and fought and in many cases died for protections that we now take entirely for granted. But progress is not a destination. It is a direction. And the moment a society decides it has arrived, that it has solved the problem, that the people being ground up by invisible systems are someone else's concern in some other era, that is precisely the moment the blindness sets back in. The people in this video did not think of themselves as victims of history. They thought of themselves as workers. They woke up, they did their jobs, they came home when they could, they loved their families and argued with their neighbors and had opinions about the weather. They were not symbols. They were not cautionary tales. They were people living the only lives available to them in the world they had been born into. The least we can do, the absolute minimum, is remember that they existed, that their labor was real, that their suffering was real, that the world we inherited was built, in part, on what it cost them. This channel exists to tell those stories. Not the stories of kings and generals and the men whose names ended up on buildings. The stories of the people who made the buildings possible. The people underneath history, holding it up. If that is a project you want to be part of, subscribe. Leave a comment telling me which profession from today's video disturbed you the most, or which one you had never heard of before. I read every single one. And if you know someone who finds this kind of history as compelling as I do, share this video with them. Not for the numbers, because these stories deserve more people to know them. I will see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves. And maybe, just maybe, take a moment today to think about who made your morning possible. Because somewhere, right now, there is a knocker-up walking in the cold. And most of us will never know her name.